hand rose slowly over the tin plate, thin fingers skinned like paper. She was not asking for seconds. She was pointing at the steak, her eyes wide trembling, not with hunger, but with disbelief. The mess hall had fallen silent. A dozen Japanese women sat frozen, their first meal in Texas steaming in front of them. But it was the steak, thick pink centered, sizzling with salt and butter, that stole the breath from every throat. One woman pointed at hers and whispered something in Japanese. The cowboy watching from the doorway thought he had misread her. Then another pointed too. Then another. "Is it for us?" one finally asked through a translator. The cowboy just nodded, and then came the tears. Not loud sob, just quiet shaking hands covering mouths. For women who had spent years being told they were expendable, this was not just meat. It was disbelief, dignity, and devastation served on a white enamel plate. The smell of steak filled the room. But the real story was the silence. The cowboys stood at the edges of the mess hall, their hats in their hands, watching like men who had accidentally stepped into a church. They were not used to reverence. Not like this. Not in a dining room with folding chairs and tin trays. But something about the way those Japanese women stared at the plates in front of them made even the loudest ranch hands forget their boots were muddy and their belts creaked. One woman, her braid undone and eyes sunken from months of hunger, simply rested a trembling hand on the edge of her tray. She had not touched the meat yet. She just looked at it like it was an altar, and she was not sure if she was allowed to pray. No one spoke. The clang of utensils had not yet begun. The hiss of butter on beef still lingered in the rafters like smoke from a battlefield that had not cooled. The room was warm, full of scents they had not known in years. Salt, fat, real onions. But the warmth could not reach the tight knots inside their chests. For many of them, this was the first enclosed space that did not smell of disinfectant or gunpowder. That alone made their stomachs tighten with suspicion. The Americans had said nothing about dinner. They had been led into the hall without barking or shoves, just a quiet line of motion. Women in ill-fitting uniforms and shoes tied with string. They had expected punishment, or at the very least, cold silence. They had not expected steak, and yet here it was. Thick slices of it grilled and pink at the center, placed beside piles of soft bread and mashed potatoes rich with butter. Real butter, not lard, not oil, not powdered substitute. Butter. A few leaned back from the trays, whispering in Japanese voices, low and urgent. Was it a trap? Was it poisoned? One woman blinked hard, whispering words the cowboys could not understand. Another thought she recognized the meal from a dream she used to have when her belly shrank smaller than her ribs. A steak, a warm room, and the terrible ache of needing to believe it was real. But dreams always faded, and this was too much. One by one they pointed, not to ask, not to demand, just to make sure it was truly there. The cowboy shifted awkwardly. One cleared his throat, rubbed the back of his neck, and whispered to the cook behind the line, "They don't know it's for them." The cook, a barrel-chested man with grease on his apron and flour dusting his thick forearms, looked up and met the women's eyes. He offered a nod, slow and deliberate, the kind of nod a father gives when he wants his children to know something is safe. "It's theirs," he said. All of it. His name was Pete, 40-something, a man who had cooked for ranch hands and soldiers and now found himself cooking for the enemy. But when he looked at these women skeletal and shaking, he did not see enemies. He saw hunger, and hunger he believed had no nationality. Another woman picked up her fork, hand trembling like a leaf in wind, and touched the meat as if it might bite her back. She glanced at the cowboy near the door, eyes wet, and whispered something too soft to translate. He did not understand her words, but he understood her face. He gave her the smallest nod, the kind you give a frightened horse. "Easy now, it's safe." Then came the first bite. She chewed slowly, reverently, as if her mouth had forgotten the mechanics of fullness. Her eyes fluttered not from pleasure, though the taste must have been dizzying, but from the sudden weight of everything she had lost to arrive at this moment. The warmth of the meat filled her like a memory. Her mother's voice, her father's hands, her brother gone in the firebombing. None of them had tasted meat like this in years, perhaps never. Another woman began to eat, then another, then another. The room did not explode into chatter or laughter. There were no cries of joy. There was only the soft sound of chewing, of tin forks tapping against trays, of breaths held and released. For the women, steak was not just nourishment, it was a betrayal of everything they had been taught. The enemy feeds us. The enemy treats us like people. The enemy serves steak. The Cowboys watched with furrowed brows. They had expected prisoners. They had expected the glare of hatred or the weight of defiance. They had not expected tears or the sight of grown women holding forks like sacred relics. One young rancher leaned over to another and murmured, "We're feeding ghosts." His friend, still holding his hat like it might anchor him to the floor, replied, "No, we're bringing them back to life." And in that barn-shaped mess hall, somewhere between the scent of sizzling beef and the echo of distant war, something broke, and something else began. But the steak was the easy part. What came next would shatter everything these women had been trained to believe about the enemy, and it would start with a cowboy and a fork. 6 months earlier, there was only silence. Keiko had learned that silence was survival. Not just in the literal sense, in the bomb shelters beneath the roar of sirens, where even a cough might draw fire, but in the cultural sense, in the code in Bushido. From the moment she was conscripted as a field nurse at 16, Keiko understood that her voice belonged to the empire. Her body belonged to duty. Her hunger, her fear, her grief, all of it had to be swallowed. She remembered the training barracks, the paper-thin walls where girls lay shoulder to shoulder, shivering under stiff blankets, and memorizing the phrases carved into wooden plaques. Endure without complaint. Surrender is disgrace. The emperor is father, mother, God. Every morning they shouted these words into the air like prayers. Every night they recited them again with mouths cracked from thirst and hearts hollowed by obedience. Keiko did not question it. No one did. Not after seeing what happened to the girl who hesitated during drills. She was slapped hard enough to draw blood and made to kneel in gravel for hours. The instructor, a woman whose own sons had died in the Pacific, stood over her without mercy. "Compassion is for the weak," the instructor had barked, "and the weak serve no purpose." That phrase would echo in Keiko's skull for years. Long after the empire had fallen, long after the stake, the girl who had hesitated, a thin thing named Hannah with a birthmark on her cheek, never spoke again. Not during drills, not during meals, not even when she was reassigned to the worst ward in the hospital where men died screaming and there was never enough morphine. She simply became silence itself. And in that transformation, she became the model they were all supposed to follow. By the time Keiko was sent to a makeshift military hospital near Nagoya, she had stopped crying. She stitched wounds with trembling fingers, cleaned blood from stretchers, and learned how to wipe a dying man's face without blinking. The nurses around her were little more than children. Same as her, girls turned to cogs in a dying machine. They whispered among themselves at night about the bombings, about the shortages, about how rice had turned into bark and sugar into dust. But they never spoke of doubt, not openly. Doubt was more dangerous than hunger. They heard rumors, of course, that American prisoners were treated better than their own, that Allied leaflets showed smiling faces, hot meals, open hands. But no one believed them, or rather, they could not afford to. One nurse tore up a leaflet and burned it before anyone else could see. "It's a lie," she muttered. "It has to be." To believe the enemy could show mercy meant unlearning everything they had been taught. It meant admitting that the suffering, the starvation, the silence had been for nothing. That possibility was more terrifying than any bomb. Keiko's own brother Takeshi had died believing the same thing she did. That surrender was shame. That survival was treason. He had written her one letter before being sent to the front. In it, he told her, "If I fall, do not mourn me. Mourn only if I break." He was 17. His body was never found. But Keiko knew he had not broken. Whatever had killed him, explosion or bullet or starvation, he had faced it with the silence they had all been trained to carry. She kept that letter folded inside her blouse the day she boarded the transport to the coast. The war was over by then, though no one had told her directly. The hospital had emptied. The shouting had stopped. Officers vanished like ghosts. A nurse whispered the unthinkable. The emperor had spoken in his own voice and said they must accept the unacceptable. They were rounded up, not by shouting soldiers, but by quiet ones. American Marines with strange expressions. Not glee or anger, but something in between. Curiosity, weariness, maybe even pity. Keiko did not know how to process any of it. The silence had always been armor. Now it became a shroud. They crossed the ocean on a ship that smelled of steel and soap. They slept in bunks with real mattresses. They were fed, not generously but enough. Some girls vomited from the shock of rich food. Others wept in the dark, unable to believe they were still alive. Keiko ate quietly. She said nothing. Not when they landed in America. Not when the cowboy handed her the tray. Not even when she saw the steak and remembered that her father had only eaten it once in a restaurant on payday before the war swallowed their lives whole. Her silence was not fear anymore. It was history. It was ritual. It was the last thing she could still control. So when she lifted her fork in that barn-shaped mess hall, she did it slowly, like a ritual, like she was breaking something sacred. She placed the meat in her mouth, chewed, swallowed, and something cracked. Not just in her, but in the idea of who she was supposed to be. It was not just steak. It was the weight of everything that had come before it, everything stripped from her, everything burned into her, everything left behind in a country collapsing under its own silence. Keiko had grown up believing that rice was enough, that honor was more filling than soup, that loyalty to the emperor could make a stomach forget it was empty. But war had a way of starving both body and belief. By the final year, there was almost nothing left. The markets had vanished into smoke. Shops once lined with noodles and pickles now stood with shutters bolted, windows broken. People whispered of food as if it were myth. Sugar was a dream, salt a memory. Even rice, the backbone of Japan, had become rare enough to hoard in cloth bundles and count grain by grain. Keiko's mother had once soaked acorns in water for days trying to leach out the bitterness. Her younger sister coughed up bark after swallowing it in desperation. There was no shame in it, only silence. Most days, Keiko worked 12 hours in the hospital and returned to find nothing waiting but a cold tin bowl. Dandelions boiled and mashed, half a potato skin and all. A gray ball of barley, sticky and sour. But the worst was the rice substitute, shaped like rice but made of chestnut husks and wheat husks, sometimes little more than shredded weeds. It crumbled in the mouth like ash. It smelled of paper. But she ate it anyway, they all did. Her last meal in Japan had been a handful of real rice, white soft clumped with sweat and salt. One strip of seaweed wrapped around it like a ribbon on a corpse. She remembered crouching behind a fallen fence post, the siren still echoing across Nagoya, lifting that rice ball to her lips with shaking fingers. She ate it slowly, eyes fixed on the distant cloud where her neighborhood used to be. Smoke coiled upward. Her sister was somewhere beneath it. Her mother, too. She did not cry. She finished the rice and stood up. Then came the orders. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. But surrender did not feel like peace. It felt like vanishing. They were taken to the docks in silence. No goodbye. No fanfare. The ship that waited was not a prison hulk. It was something stranger. American. Clean. Functional. The bunks were made of steel and smelled like oil. The food was rationed, measured, placed on trays. They were fed 3 times a day. Most of the women did not know what to make of it. Some refused to eat. Others hoarded bread crusts under their pillows. A few vomited from the shock of real butter or the richness of beans. Keiko forced herself to eat half portions, never finishing anything. It felt like theft. No one explained where they were going. They just floated across the water, watching their country disappear behind them like a burnt page. The ocean was endless. The air below deck never changed. They spoke little. No one had the words. When they finally docked, it was not into gunfire or dogs. It was into sunlight, bright and clean and unbearable. The air smelled of salt and pine, not smoke. They were moved again, onto trains, then onto trucks, until the countryside changed. Green fields, barbed wire, a windmill. Cows. It felt more like a painting than a prison. The gates of the Texas ranch camp stood open when they arrived, guarded but not snarling. The buildings were wooden, low, warm in color. A man tipped his hat. Another offered a drink of water. No orders were shouted. No one spat. One girl whispered that perhaps this was not a camp at all, but a mistake. Keiko did not respond. Her stomach ached from the long ride. But she had learned not to ask for food. Hunger had become habit. She did not expect kindness to follow. Then came the steak, and then came the silence again. Not from fear this time, but from not knowing what came next. Keiko sat still with her tray, the steak before her already cooled at the edges. She had seen other women begin to eat, hesitant, trembling, some crying without sound, but she could not yet bring herself to move. The fork in her hand felt foreign, heavy. Its clean, polished surface reflected her hollow face back at her like a stranger. She did not know where to start. The meat was thick, soft-looking, glistening in its juices, too large to eat in one bite, too rich to believe. She glanced around the table. Beside her sat Tomiko, 24 years old, her face lined with exhaustion, but her hands steady. Tomiko had been a cook once back in Osaka before the restaurants closed and the city burned. Her fingers moved differently than the others, with muscle memory that had not forgotten the weight of a knife or the rhythm of chopping vegetables. Across from them, Yuki, barely 16, the youngest among them, stared at her plate with wide eyes. Yuki had been conscripted only 3 months before the war ended. She still carried a kind of innocence the others had lost. She looked to Keiko now as if asking permission to believe this was real. Near the end of the table sat Chio, 19, thin as a reed, her eyes always distant, as if composing poems in her head. She had been a student before the war. Literature, philosophy. Now she just stared at the steak like it was a puzzle she could not solve. A cowboy nearby, young, maybe not even 20, watched Keiko from the side of the mess hall. His sleeves were rolled up, his skin tanned and freckled from the sun. He was not armed. His rifle was slung behind the door, forgotten. He saw her sitting there, unmoving, holding the fork as if it might snap between her fingers. He stepped forward slowly, boots scuffing against the wooden floor. No one noticed except Keiko. He crouched beside her, hands raised like he was approaching a skittish horse. No words, just a gentle smile and a nod toward the tray. Then he picked up a spare fork from a nearby stack, sat on his heels, and pantomimed. He mimed the gesture of cutting, 2 fingers, tracing the edge of the meat, a pretend knife in his palm, slicing downward, slow and exaggerated. Then he mimed picking up a bite, lifting it to his mouth, chewing with exaggerated satisfaction, eyes closed, nodding. He pointed at the steak on her tray and nodded again, like asking permission, like saying, "It's okay, you can do this." Keiko blinked. Something in her chest loosened. She looked down at her own fork, then back at him. He reached over and with a gentle tap guided her hand to the edge of the meat. The metal was cool against her skin. She pressed the fork down just as he had shown her. Then he mimed again, a sawing motion, slow, patient, his hands moving in the air like he was teaching a child to tie shoes. It felt absurd. It felt ridiculous. And yet she did it. The steak yielded easily. It came apart in fibers she had not seen in years. Not stringy bits of tendon, like in the war rations, but soft, pink, juicy muscle. She cut a piece, then another. The juice pooled on the plate, rich and dark. The cowboy sat back on his heels, arms on his knees, watching quietly like a man who was not sure if he had done too much. She lifted the fork, bit, chewed, and then barely audible, she laughed. It was not a full laugh, not yet, but it was the shape of one. A sound she had not heard come from her own mouth in months, maybe longer. The absurdity of it, the lesson, the pantomime, the cowboy kneeling next to her tray like a schoolboy playing charades. It had pierced something deeper than fear. The moment felt weightless, like wind after a storm. She looked up at him, eyes shining, and nodded. He grinned. "There it is," he said, even though she could not understand. Then he stood, tipped his hat, and walked away. His name was Cole, 22 years old. He had lost his brother James at Iwo Jima 6 months earlier. James had written him letters about the war, about the hatred, about how hard it was to see the enemy as human. Cole had kept those letters, read them until the paper thinned. And when these Japanese women arrived at the camp, he had thought of James and decided to tremble. That one gesture, just a fork, just a smile, did what no guard tower, no order, no ration could do. It broke the wall, not down, but enough for air to get in. Around the room, other women had seen. One mimicked the motion she had witnessed, timidly cutting her steak with new confidence. Another giggled behind her hand, then sobered instantly, as if she had done something wrong. But no punishment came. No scolding, Only the scrape of forks and the slow bloom of something new. A shared silent understanding that maybe this place did not run on the rules they had known. And somewhere in the back of the mess hall, another cowboy chuckled. "Well, I'll be," he muttered to his friend. "She just needed a little help with the math." His friend raised a brow. "What math?" The cowboy grinned. "Steak divided by fork equals trust." No one laughed, but Keiko did, quietly, under her breath. And for the first time in what felt like another lifetime, she kept eating. Not because she was hungry, but because she wanted to. From the back of the hall, an older cowboy stood apart from the others, arms crossed, face weathered and hard. He watched the scene with something that was not quite approval. His jaw worked, his eyes narrowed. His name was Wade, 35 years old, maybe 40. Hard to tell with a face carved by his son in grief. He had lost his son at Guadalcanal, a boy barely old enough to shave, sent to die on an island whose name Wade still could not pronounce without choking. And now here they were, feeding the enemy, laughing with them, teaching them how to cut meat like they were guests at a Sunday dinner instead of prisoners of war. Wade turned and walked out. The screen door slammed behind him, the sound sharp in the quiet evening air. That night, when the lights dimmed and the mess hall emptied, hunger was no longer the loudest thing in the room. The warmth of full bellies settled awkwardly in their frames, like wearing someone else's coat. Soft, comforting, but unfamiliar enough to make them restless. Keiko lay on her bunk, the sheets surprisingly clean, the mattress not thin enough to feel like punishment. The ceiling above her was wooden with knotted beams and spiderwebs in the corners. No rats, no screaming, no marching boots, only the sound of breathing and crying. It was quiet at first, muffled saws into pillows, sleeves pulled over mouths, trying not to be heard, not from pain, not from fear, but from the weight of it all, the shame of still being alive, the guilt of eating when others had not. Keiko turned her face toward the wall. She had not cried in years, not when the bombs came, not when her sister disappeared into the fire, not even when they were told Japan had surrendered and everything they believed in turned to ash. But now, in a quiet American bunkhouse that smelled faintly of soap and hay, her chest ached with something unfamiliar. A fracture, a feeling. Across the room, one of the girls was writing, not openly but secretly, curled over a piece of paper like a prisoner sketching escape. It was Chio, thin, bookish, always whispering to herself in lines of poetry. She had found a stub of a pencil tucked inside a cracked floorboard. And now she wrote by moonlight, the words tiny and sharp. Keiko could see the concentration on her face, even from the dark. Later, when Chio climbed down from her bunk and returned quietly, she slid the folded paper beneath her mattress. Keiko would find it days later when the floor was being swept. The note was short, just 2 lines in neat characters. "They fed us like humans." What does that mean? It was not a question meant to be answered. It was an echo. The women did not talk about it out loud. Not the steak, not the cowboy, not the laughter. To speak of it was to admit something had changed. And change was dangerous. Change meant letting go. Letting go meant betrayal. Not of their country, but of the silence they had sworn to carry. Bushido did not teach them how to process kindness. It taught them how to It taught them that survival was not noble unless it came with service. That being captured was dishonor. That being fed by the enemy was worse than defeat. It was a humiliation that reached into the soul and pulled the roots loose. So they kept still. Stoic. Some turned toward the walls. Faces blank. Others folded their hands over their stomachs, trying not to feel the fullness. A few whispered old proverbs like prayers. A woman's silence is her dignity. A bowed head protects the heart. The emperor sees even what is hidden. Keiko stared at the ceiling for a long time, then at the faint shape of the barn roof, visible through the window. The stars outside were too many. In Nagoya, the sky had always been choked with smoke. Here it was open, too open. It made her feel small. She rolled onto her side, clutching her thin blanket. The steak still lingered in her body, not as taste, but as memory. She could feel it in her bones, in the strange looseness of her limbs. She wondered what her father would say, if he knew, if he would call her weak or lost. She wondered if shame could survive this kind of mercy, or if mercy given freely was its own kind of punishment. In the darkness, someone whispered, "Why are they feeding us?" No one answered. They just lay there. In the night of full stomachs, haunted by something heavier than hunger. By morning, the taste had not left Keiko's mouth. It lingered like a ghost. Salt, fat, heat rising unbidden when she swallowed, when she breathed, when she closed her eyes. She washed her face at the basin, cold water shocking her skin. But the memory remained. Not just the steak itself, but what it unlocked. Food, she realized, was not merely sustenance. In a country starved into obedience, it had become spiritual. Meat was not eaten, it was remembered. She could still see her father at the low table, years before the war, sleeves rolled up, laughing as he cut thin slices of beef for a family celebration. The meat had been scarce even then, but they had shared it carefully, dipping each piece in salt like it was sacred. Her mother had warned them not to waste even a grain. Salt is work, she said. Fat is life. Keiko had not understood at the time. She did now. The war took those flavors first. Salt disappeared. Oil followed. Meat vanished entirely, replaced by rumors. A neighbor once traded a wedding kimono for a handful of dried fish. Another boiled shoe leather until it softened enough to chew. When Keiko first learned that horses were being slaughtered, she felt shame and relief in equal measure. Shame for the thought, relief for the calories. That was how the war taught them to think. So when the steak returned, not thin, not rationed, not begged for, but placed freely on a plate, it did something violent to her insides. It was not pleasure. It was rebellion. Her tongue remembered before her mind could stop it. The salt struck first, sharp and electric. Then the fat bloomed, coating her mouth, carrying warmth into places that had forgotten what warmth felt like. Her body reacted before ideology could intervene. That betrayal tasted like life. At breakfast there was bacon. The smell alone made several women turn away. Keiko sat stiffly, hands folded, eyes fixed on the table. Bacon had been a word from childhood, from markets, from laughter. Now it lay in front of her, curling and glossy, popping faintly in its own grease. She felt heat creep up her neck. To enjoy this would be obscene. To refuse it would be foolish. She picked up a piece and ate it slowly. Eyes down, shame followed immediately, thick and suffocating. Across the ocean, her mother might be boiling weeds. Her sister, if she was alive, might be gnawing on bark. That thought lodged in Keiko's throat like a bone. Each bite here was an imbalance. Each swallow a quiet theft. She imagined writing home, trying to explain. There were no words that could cross that distance without wounding someone. The women spoke of it only in fragments. It tastes like before, one whispered. I feel sick, another said, meaning not her stomach, but her conscience. A third laughed too loudly and then stopped. Hand clamped over her mouth as if she had sinned. Enjoyment felt dangerous. It felt disloyal, and yet their bodies leaned into it all the same. Hunger had trained them to accept whatever came. Their hearts lagged behind. The Cowboys noticed the tension but did not comment. They served breakfast, wiped tables, refilled cups. One man salted his own food heavily and then paused, glancing at the women as if suddenly aware of the luxury of choice. He pushed the salt shaker farther down the table, closer to them, then thought better of it and left it where it was. Compassion, Keiko learned, could also be awkward. Later assigned light chores, she found herself near the kitchen. The smell of rendered fat hung in the air. A pan hissed softly. She watched as Pete the cook scraped bacon grease into a tin for later use. Later use, the idea stunned her. Fat not as treasure to be hoarded, but as something abundant enough to save. The war had taught her that nothing came later. Everything was now or never. That afternoon, guilt settled deeper. It followed her like a shadow as she folded laundry, as she swept the floor, as she drank clean water without counting the sips. She felt heavier, not just in body but in responsibility. To survive better than those she loved felt like a betrayal without a crime. And yet when dinner came, she ate again. Not because she was weak, not because she had forgotten, but because the taste had reminded her of something the war had tried to erase, that she was alive, that life when offered without cruelty carried its own meaning. She ate with tears in her eyes and salt on her tongue, holding both at once, salt and shame, fat and memory, compassion served hot. The next morning, the women were called to the courtyard, not to be counted, not to be drilled, but to be given chores. It was the kind of work no one had expected. Feeding chickens, sweeping barns, sorting linens. Not orders barked through clenched jaws, but instructions spoken with simple words and even simpler gestures. The guards stood back. The cowboys leaned on fence posts. There was no suspicion in the air, only sun and dust and the smell of livestock. For the first time in years, Keiko's work did not revolve around war. She was not sterilizing bloody bandages or sorting morphine under candlelight. She was not rationing painkillers or holding down boys missing limbs. Now she was sweeping a wooden floor, folding sun-dried sheets, stacking plates. It was mundane. It was repetitive. But there was something healing in that rhythm, something quietly sacred about doing something that did not end in silence or death. Tomiko was asked to help in the kitchen. She had been a cook once. Back in Osaka, her hands had a memory that had not faded. She said little, but her movements were precise. Peeling potatoes, measuring flour. She handled the utensils with the reverence of someone holding family heirlooms. That's when it happened. She was stirring marinade in a wide metal bowl when she spotted the cut of meat sitting nearby. Thick, red, marbled. A steak. She froze. Spoon in hand, her shoulders tensed, her breath hitched. The scent of vinegar and herbs rose into her nose and cracked something open. She did not cry loudly, just tears, sudden and uninvited, rolling down her face like rain off a roof. She set the spoon down slowly, as if it were glass, and turned away. Pete, who had been passing through with a sack of flour, paused at the doorway. He did not know what to say. She did not expect him to. After a moment, he fumbled in his back pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and stepped forward hesitantly. Not close enough to offend, just close enough to offer. She did not take it at first. Then she did. Their eyes met for half a second. Something passed between them. Not words, not apology, not explanation. Just a recognition that the war had ended in some places before it had ended in others. And here in this quiet kitchen, in the heart of Texas, it was still ending, piece by piece. Tomiko wiped her eyes, folded the handkerchief carefully, and returned to work. She asked to help prepare the meal. The shift was subtle but profound. To prepare a meal meant control, meant participation, meant choosing to give instead of always being the one to receive under force. It was a different kind of nourishment, one that worked in both directions. Pete watched her work for a moment, then quietly pulled out a small card from his apron pocket. He wrote on it with a stubby pencil. Measurements, temperatures, little notes about flour and butter and how to make the biscuits flaky. He slid it across the counter when she was not looking. Left it there like a secret. Tomiko found it later, read the careful handwriting, and tucked it into her own apron pocket, close to her heart. That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the barn, the women hung laundry together. One of the cowboys passed by with a bucket of oats for the horses. He paused near them, scratched the back of his neck, and said in slow English, "Dinner's beans tonight. No steak. Sorry, ladies." They did not understand the words. But he smiled, and Yuki, the youngest of them, laughed, not mockingly, just openly, without fear. The cowboy grinned in wider and walked on. Small things like that began to happen more often. An extra slice of cornbread, a gesture to sit down when they looked uncertain, a moment where two people stood beside one another. Not as enemies, not as strangers, but as workers in the same dust and sun. Even the way they handed tools changed, less like passing orders, more like offering something with care. But not everyone saw it that way. Wade stood at the edge of the barn, arms crossed, jaw tight. He had watched the whole scene. The laughter, the smiles, the cowboy making jokes in English that the prisoners did not understand but responded to anyway. He did not like it, not one bit. Wade was older than the others, 35, maybe 40. Hard to tell with a face weathered by sun and grief. He had lost his son at Guadalcanal, a boy barely old enough to shave, sent to die on an island whose name Wade still could not pronounce without choking. The boy's name had been Michael. He had written Wade letters about the heat, about the jungle, about how he missed his mother's cooking and the sound of rain on their tin roof back home. The last letter had arrived 3 weeks after the telegram, and now here they were, feeding the enemy, laughing with them, teaching them how to cut meat like they were guests at a Sunday dinner instead of prisoners of war. It turned his stomach. That evening, after the women had been escorted back to their quarters, Wade cornered Cole by the horse stalls. "You're getting too comfortable with them," Wade said, his voice low but sharp. Cole looked up from brushing down a mare. "They're just people, Wade. They're prisoners, enemy combatants. The war's over." Wade stepped closer, his shadow falling across the stall. "My boy died fighting these people. You think he'd want us serving them steak dinners?" Cole set down the brush, met Wade's eyes. "Your boy died so we could be better than the enemy." "Not the same." Wade's jaw worked, his fist clenched at his sides. "That's easy for you to say. You didn't lose anyone." Cole's face hardened. "I lost my brother at Iwo Jima, February 45. So don't tell me I don't know loss." The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, Wade spoke again, quieter this time, but no less dangerous. "I've written to General Miller, told him what's happening here. The soft treatment, the coddling." Cole straightened. "You did what inspections coming in 2 weeks. And when Miller sees what's been going on, this little tea party of yours is over." Wade turned and walked away, boots heavy on the wooden floor. Cole stood alone in the dim light of the barn, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of what Wade had just set in motion. Inside the bunkhouse, Keiko could not sleep. The guilt had settled into her bones now, deeper than hunger ever had. She rolled onto her side and watched Chio in the bunk across from her. The thin girl was writing again. By moonlight, the pencil stubs scratching softly against paper. Keiko had seen her do this every night since they arrived. Always secret, always careful. She wondered what Chio was writing. Poems, probably. The girl had always been bookish, always lost in words. But tonight Chio did something different. She folded the paper carefully, slipped it into an envelope she must have found somewhere, and addressed it in neat characters. Keiko sat up. "What are you doing?" Chio, startled, nearly dropped the envelope, then relaxed when she saw it was only Keiko. "Writing to my cousins," she whispered, "in Kobe. You cannot send that. They will read it." Chio looked down at the envelope. "I know, but someone needs to know." "Know what?" "That we are alive, that the Americans are not demons." Keiko felt her chest tighten. "If you tell them the truth, they will think we have betrayed our country." Chio met her eyes. "Have we?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Keiko did not know how to answer it, because part of her wondered the same thing. Every time she tasted bacon, every time she laughed without punishment, every time a cowboy offered a small kindness and she accepted it. Was survival betrayal? Was eating treason? Was laughter defeat? "What will you say?" Keiko finally asked. Chio unfolded the letter and read aloud, soft enough that only Keiko could hear. "They fed us steak. We sleep in beds. No one shouts. There is laughter. I am confused. I am alive." Keiko closed her eyes. Those words, so simple, so honest, so dangerous. "If that letter reaches Japan," she said, "it will bring shame to all of us." Or Chio replied quietly, "It will bring truth." In the morning, Chio showed the letter to the others. There was debate, whispered and urgent. An older woman, her face lined with years of obedience, shook her head. "You will dishonor us all, admitting we accepted enemy mercy. But it is the truth," Yuki said, the youngest among them. "Why should we hide the truth?" Tomiko, who had broken down in the kitchen just days before, spoke carefully. "Maybe someone in Japan needs to know that not all enemies are monsters. Maybe that is how we rebuild." Keiko thought of her brother's letter, the one she still carried. "Mourn only if I break." Was accepting kindness breaking? Or was it the opposite? "Send it," Keiko said finally. "Someone needs to know." Chio nodded, sealed the envelope. And the next day she handed it to the camp administrator, asking if it could be sent through the Red Cross Postal Service. The administrator, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a bureaucrat's caution, took it, promised to forward it, and Chio returned to her bunk that night, not knowing if she had done something brave or something unforgivable. The letter traveled slowly, through channels, through bureaucracy, through the careful hands of Red Cross workers who screened every word for military intelligence. It arrived in Tokyo 3 weeks later, but not to Chiyo's cousin. It landed on the desk of Colonel Hayashi Daichi, a man in his 50s, Interior Ministry. His job was simple: read letters from prisoners of war, redact anything dangerous, protect the narrative. He opened Chiyo's letter in his small office. Half the building was still ruins from the bombings. The other half smelled of mildew and ash. Through the broken window, he could hear children playing in the rubble. They had made a game of finding intact bricks. He read it once, then twice, then a fourth time. Slower. The words were simple, but their implications roared like fire. They fed us steak. We sleep in beds. No one shouts. There is laughter. I am confused. I am alive. Hayashi set the letter down, stood up, stared out the window at the city struggling to rebuild itself. Orphans begging in the streets, mothers searching through rubble. His own daughter was dead, burned in the firebombing. His wife had starved slowly, refusing to take food when there was not enough for the children. Her name had been Akemi, 16 years old. She had wanted to be a teacher. She had kept a diary full of pressed flowers and careful observations about the changing seasons. Hayashi had found that diary in the ruins. The pages were burned at the edges, but the words were still legible. The last entry, written the day before the bombing, said simply, "I hope when this war ends, we remember how to be kind again." And here in his hand was proof that captured Japanese daughters were eating steak in America, while their families gnawed on bark in Tokyo. He could not allow this letter to reach its destination. But he could not ignore it either. He made a copy, locked the original in his desk, and late that night behind closed doors, he read it aloud to a small group of censors and officers. At first there was silence, then a cough, then a muttered curse. One man stood up, eyes wet with rage. "She thanks them," he hissed. "She thanks them for steak." But another man, younger, freshly demobilized, shook his head. "She does not thank them. She is confused by them. There is a difference." What difference? The first man spat. "The difference," the younger officer said slowly, "is that confusion can lead to questions. And questions can crack walls. If prisoners write of comfort, of decency, of something resembling peace, then what happens to the hatred that held us together?" Hayashi listened to them argue, but he was not thinking about policy or propaganda. He was thinking about his daughter, 16 years old, the same age as some of these prisoners. If she had survived, if she had been captured by Americans, what would he have wanted for her? Starvation, cruelty, or a bed and a meal, and the small mercy of being treated like a human being? He knew the answer, and it made him feel like a traitor to his own grief. That night, Hayashi could not sleep. He walked the streets of Tokyo, past the ruins, past the makeshift shelters, past the children with hollow eyes who looked like the women in that Texas camp probably once looked. And he realized something that terrified him, that the Americans, by feeding their enemies, had done something more dangerous than any bomb. They had made it impossible to hate them purely. Hatred required simplicity, monsters on one side, heroes on the other. But a monster who feeds you steak is no longer a monster. And that ambiguity, that uncomfortable mercy, was more destabilizing than any weapon. Hayashi returned to his office, pulled out a piece of paper, and began to write, not a report, but a letter. To General Miller, the American officer whose name appeared on the inspection roster. He did not write to condemn, he wrote to confess. "General Miller," he began, "I have spent this war ordering death. I have sent boys to die believing they served honor. I have told mothers their sons' sacrifices were glorious. This letter from a POW camp haunts me more than any battlefield report. My daughter died in the Tokyo firebombing. She was 16, the same age as some of these prisoners. If she had survived, if she had been captured by American forces, I would have prayed to gods I no longer believe in, that someone would feed her, that someone would teach her how to hold a fork, that someone would see her as human when her own country had taught her she was expendable. If our daughters write of enemy mercy while our sons write of hatred, which generation will rebuild our nation? I cannot destroy this letter. Perhaps you should not destroy this kindness." He signed it, sealed it, and sent it through his own channels, knowing it would arrive before the inspection, knowing it would either save what was happening in Texas or condemn it, but also knowing that some truths needed to be spoken. even by the enemy, even by a man who had lost everything. Back in Texas, the women did not know that Chio's letter had become a spark. They did not know about Colonel Hayashi or his confession. They only knew that something was shifting in the camp. The Cowboys were more tense. Wade watched them constantly, and there were whispers of an inspection coming, of generals and clipboards, and the possibility that the steak dinners might end as suddenly as they had begun. Keiko lay in her bunk that night, listening to the others breathe, wondering if kindness was always this fragile, if mercy only lasted until someone with authority decided it was too expensive. She thought about the fork lesson, the cowboy's patient hands, the way he had smiled when she laughed. She thought about Tomiko crying in the kitchen, and the handkerchief, and the recipe card she had seen Pete slip into Tomiko's apron pocket. She thought about Yuki laughing without fear, and the cowboys who responded not with punishment but with grins. All of it felt so small, so insignificant against the weight of war and empire and the grinding machinery of history. But maybe she thought that was the point. Maybe the small things were the only things that mattered. Because the big things, the grand strategies, and the righteous causes had led to this. To starvation and silence, and a world that taught children it was nobler to gain than to survive. Maybe a steak and a fork and a laugh were revolutionary precisely because they were small, because they were human, because they refused to accept that mercy was weakness. Or maybe she was just trying to justify the fact that she had eaten bacon that morning and enjoyed it. She did not know anymore. And that uncertainty, that crack in the armor of her certainty felt both terrifying and strangely freeing. Across the room, Chio was writing again, a new letter, or maybe a poem. Keiko could not tell in the dark, but she hoped quietly and without speaking it aloud that whatever Chio was writing it was honest, that it told the truth even when the truth was complicated, even when the truth made people uncomfortable. Because if this strange mercy in the middle of Texas meant anything at all, it meant that truth was more important than comfort, that humanity was more important than ideology, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was accept a meal from the hand of your enemy and let it change you. 2 weeks after Chio sent her letter, the announcement came. The camp commander gathered everyone in the courtyard, cowboys and prisoners alike. His face was neutral, but there was tension in the way he held the clipboard. General Miller will be conducting an inspection, he said, September 15th, 2 weeks from today. He did not need to say more. Everyone understood what an inspection meant. Questions, scrutiny, the possibility that everything could change. Wade stood at the back of the group, arms still crossed. But now there was something like satisfaction in his eyes. He had set this in motion. And now the reckoning was coming. Cole felt his stomach drop. He glanced toward the women's section, saw Keiko standing very still, her face unreadable. But he could see the tension in her shoulders. She knew too. They all did. The softness that had begun to grow here, fragile as new grass, was about to be tested. That night, the atmosphere in the camp shifted. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The cowboys were quieter, more formal. They still served meals, but the easy banter was gone. The smiles were fewer. At dinner, the portions were smaller. No dessert. The steak was replaced with plain chicken. Still better than starvation rations. But the message was clear. Things were tightening. Yuki noticed first. She looked around the mess hall with wide eyes, then whispered to Keiko in Japanese. Is it ending? Are they taking it back? Keiko did not answer, but she felt the same cold fear settling into her chest. They had been foolish to hope, to believe, to let themselves taste something that was never meant to last. Wade supervised the dinner service personally, making sure nothing excessive was given, no extra bread, no butter on the table, just adequate, military, correct. Cole watched from the doorway, his jaw tight, his hands curled into fists at his sides. After the women returned to their quarters, he found Wade by the supply shed. This is cruel, Cole said. You know that. Wade turned slowly. This is reality. They're prisoners, not family. They're people. So was my son, and he died fighting them. Cole stepped closer, voice dropping. My brother died too, at Iwo Jima. You think I forgot that? You think every time I hand one of them a plate, I don't see his face? Then why do you do it? Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, softer now. Because James wrote me a letter 2 days before he died. He said he tried to see the Japanese soldiers as people, as men with families and fears, but he couldn't. There was too much hate, too much blood. Wade said nothing. And you know what he told me? Cole continued. He said if he made it home, he wanted to try again, to see if he could look at the enemy and find the human underneath. He never got that chance. But I did. Wade's face was stone, but something flickered in his eyes. Your boy deserved better, Cole said. Mine did too. But making these women starve won't bring them back. It'll just prove that everything they died fighting against was right. That mercy is weakness, that the strong crush the defeated. Is that what you want their deaths to mean? Wade turned away, walked into the darkness. Cole did not follow, but that night Cole could not sleep either. He lay in his bunk thinking about James, about the letter he had memorized by now, about the last lines that haunted him. Tell Mom I tried to see them as people. I couldn't. Maybe that makes me a failure. Or maybe it just makes me human. Either way, I hope when this war ends, someone braver than me tries again. Cole got up, dressed quietly, and slipped out into the night. He walked to the storage shed, found a crate of apples that had come in that afternoon. Fresh, bright. He took 6 of them, wrapped them in a cloth, and carried them to the women's bunkhouse. He left them on the doorstep. No note, no explanation, just a small rebellion. A refusal to let Mercy die before the inspection even began. In the morning, Tomiko found them. She picked up the cloth bundle, unwrapped it slowly, and when she saw the apples, her eyes filled with tears. She called the others. They gathered around, staring at the fruit like it was treasure, like it was a message. Someone still sees us, Chia whispered. Or Keiko said quietly, someone is saying goodbye. But Tomiko shook her head. She pulled something from her pocket, the recipe card Pete had given her days earlier, for American biscuits, written in his careful handwriting with measurements and little notes. Add extra butter for flakiness. Don't overmix. This is not goodbye, Tomiko said. This is promise. She took one of the apples, left the others for the women to share. And that afternoon, during her kitchen shift, she did something she had been thinking about for days. She found Cole's torn work shirt in the laundry, the sleeve ripped from catching on barbed wire, and she sat in the corner of the kitchen and sewed, carefully, slowly, making the patch stronger than the original fabric. When she finished, she folded it neatly and left it on his bunk. Cole found it that evening, picked it up, ran his fingers over the stitching, and for the first time since his brother died, he wept. Not from grief, but from the sudden understanding that mercy was not something you gave. It was something you exchanged. And in that exchange, both people were changed. The day of the inspection arrived with the kind of bright Texas sun that made everything feel exposed. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to pretend. The convoy of jeeps appeared on the horizon at exactly 9 in the morning, dust clouds trailing behind them like the wake of ships. The camp had been prepared. Everything clean, everything regulation, everything exactly as military protocol demanded. General Miller stepped out of the lead vehicle. 50-something, decorated uniform, silver haircut military short. His face was the kind that had seen too much war and learned to show nothing. He carried a clipboard and a briefcase. Wade was there to greet him, saluting crisply, ready to present his case. The commander stood beside him, more nervous, less certain. Miller walked the camp perimeter, inspected the barracks, checked the food storage, took notes, asked questions in a clipped, efficient voice that gave nothing away. The women were lined up in the courtyard, standing at attention as they had been instructed. Keiko stood at the front, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Miller walked down the line, looking at each face, not with cruelty, but not with kindness either. Just assessment, calculation, the cold mathematics of military efficiency. He stopped in front of Keiko. Have you been mistreated? He asked through the translator. No, sir, Keiko replied. We are adequately fed. Adequately, Keiko hesitated, then nodded. Yes, sir. Miller studied her for a moment, his eyes sharp. He could tell she was hiding something, but he did not push, not yet. He moved down the line, asked similar questions, received similar answers. The women had been coached. They knew what to say, But then Miller returned to his briefcase, opened it, and pulled out a document. "Commander," he said, "I received some interesting correspondence before arriving here." Wade stepped forward. "As did I, sir. I believe we're referring to the same document." Miller held up a letter, not the original, but a copy. "The commander will explain the situation regarding prisoner communications." Wade pulled out his own copy, a letter intercepted from Tokyo, written by one of your prisoners. It describes treatment that goes well beyond Geneva Convention requirements. Miller read aloud, "They fed us steak. We sleep in beds. No one shouts. There is laughter." He looked up. "This constitutes a propaganda risk, makes American forces appear soft, undermines military discipline." The commander shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we believe that humane treatment would facilitate cooperation and reduce security risks." "Humane treatment," Miller repeated. "Or generous treatment." There was a difference. Everyone in the courtyard felt it. "I want to speak to the author of this letter," Miller said. Chio was brought forward. She stood in front of Miller and Wade, trembling, but also strangely calm. She had known this moment was coming. "Did you write this?" Miller asked. "Yes, sir." "Why did you mention steak specifically?" Chio looked at the translator, then back at Miller. "Because I had not tasted such food since before the war. It was significant to me." Miller's expression did not change. "This makes American treatment seem excessive." Chio took a breath, then said something the translator hesitated to repeat. "What did she say?" Miller demanded. The translator spoke carefully. "She said it seemed human, sir. That to be fed like a person, not an animal, confused her. Because in Japan they were told Americans were demons. But demons do not teach you how to use a fork." The courtyard went silent. Wade stepped forward. "This is enemy propaganda, sir, designed to make us look weak." Cole, who had been standing with the other cowboys, spoke up. "She told the truth. Not propaganda." Miller turned to him. "Were you responsible for this generous treatment?" "We all were, sir." Cole met his eyes. "It seemed like the right thing to do." "The right thing," Miller's voice was flat. "Or the comfortable thing?" Cole did not flinch. "The right thing, sir. My brother died at Iwo Jima hating the enemy. Maybe if someone had shown him that the enemy could be human, he would have died with less hate. I can't change what happened to him, but I can try to do what he wished he could have done." Miller stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned away, walked to the edge of the courtyard, looked out over the camp. Everyone waited. The sun beat down. Someone's boots scraped against gravel. But otherwise there was only silence. Miller saw the women in the yard, not lined up now, but working. Tomiko was teaching Yuki how to fold sheets properly, the way her mother had taught her, maternal and patient. Yuki was laughing at her own clumsy attempts, and Tomiko was encouraging her gently. It was such a small moment, insignificant in the scope of military operations and geopolitical strategy, but Miller saw something in it that made him stop. He saw his own daughter, 17 years old, Red Cross volunteer in London, dead in a V-2 rocket attack in 1944. She had been helping evacuate civilians when the building collapsed. Her name had been Elizabeth. She had wanted to be a nurse. She had written him letters about the war, about helping the wounded, about how she believed healing did not take sides. He had carried her last letter in his pocket for a year before he could bear to read it, and when he finally did, it said things that haunted him still. "Daddy, I know you think I'm too young for this work, but if I can help even one person, even someone on the other side, isn't that what we're supposed to be fighting for? The chance to see each other as human again." Miller pulled the second letter from his briefcase. Not Wade's complaint, but the other one. From Tokyo. From Colonel Hayashi. He returned to the group. Wade, Commander Cole, and Chio still waiting. "There is another letter," Miller said quietly. "From a Japanese colonel, Interior Ministry. His job was to censor communications from prisoners of war." He unfolded it and began to read. "General Miller, I have spent this war ordering death. I have sent boys to die believing they served honor. I have told mothers their sons' sacrifices were glorious. This letter from a POW camp haunts me more than any battlefield report." Miller's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it now, something raw. "My daughter died in the Tokyo firebombing. She was 16, the same age as some of these prisoners. If she had survived, if she had been captured by American forces, I would have prayed to gods. I no longer believe in that someone would feed her, that someone would teach her how to hold a fork, that someone would see her as human when her own country had taught her she was expendable. Wade's face had gone pale. Miller continued, if our daughters write of enemy mercy while our sons write of hatred, which generation will rebuild our nation? I cannot destroy this letter. Perhaps you should not destroy this kindness. He folded the letter, looked at Wade, then at Cole, then at the women standing in the yard. I lost my daughter, Miller said quietly. In London. She was 17. She wanted to be a nurse. She wrote me a letter before she died. Asked me if helping the enemy made her a traitor, or if refusing to help them would make her less human. His voice broke slightly. I never got to answer her. But if I could, I would tell her that the greatest victory we can have over tyranny is refusing to become it. That mercy is not weakness. It is the hardest form of strength. He turned to Wade. Your son died at Guadalcanal. Mine died protecting civilians. Both of them died in a world where hatred had consumed reason. We can honor them by perpetuating that hatred, or we can honor them by proving that humanity can survive war. Wade said nothing, but tears ran down his weathered face. His shoulders shook, and after a long moment he nodded, just once, so small it was almost invisible. Miller turned to the commander. Treatment will continue as authorized. Geneva Convention standards met and exceeded. That is my official finding. But Sir Wade started, then stopped himself. He looked at Cole, then at the women, then back at Miller. I understand, sir. Miller walked to Chio, looked down at her. You wrote the truth. That is not propaganda. That is witness. And witnesses are what prevent us from forgetting what war costs. He reached into his briefcase again, pulled out a small package. Inside was a bar of chocolate, Hershey's, and a pack of clean writing paper. Write to your mother, he said through the translator. Tell her you are alive. Tell her Americans are not demons. Tell her that when the guns stopped, some of us tried to remember how to be human again. Chio took the package, bowed deeply, and when she straightened, there were tears streaming down her face. Miller asked to speak with Keiko privately. They went into the commander's office, just the two of them and the translator. Miller sat across from her, pulled out a photograph from his wallet. My daughter, he said. Her name was Elizabeth. Keiko looked at the photo, saw a girl with a bright smile, Red Cross uniform. So young, so full of life that had been cut short. She wanted to be a nurse, Miller said. Like you. Keiko felt her throat tighten. I am sorry for your loss, sir, and I am sorry for yours. Your brother, Iwo Jima. Yes, Keiko was shocked he knew. Yes, sir. Miller was quiet for a moment. Then he said, war makes us think in categories. Enemies and allies, ours and theirs. But my daughter's last letter reminded me that those categories are lies. There is only us, humans trying to survive, trying to find meaning in the madness. He stood, looked out the window. When this war started, I believed in clear lines, good and evil, right and wrong. But the longer it went on, the more I realized that the real battle was not between nations. It was between the part of us that wants to destroy and the part that wants to heal. He turned back to her. You will go home someday, back to a Japan that is broken and rebuilding. And people will ask you about America, about your captivity. What will you tell them? Keiko thought about this, then spoke carefully through the translator. I will tell them the truth, that we expected demons, but found people, that we expected cruelty, but found confusion and mercy, and that mercy given freely is more powerful than any weapon. Miller nodded. That is what I hope you will say, because that story told honestly might help prevent the next war more than any treaty or bomb. He reached into his pocket, pulled out another photograph. This one was older, faded at the edges, Elizabeth as a child, standing next to her mother, both smiling. Keep this, he said. Remember that we all had families. We all had people we loved. And maybe remembering that is how we stop the next war before it starts. Keiko took the photograph, held it carefully, and bowed again. 2 weeks later, there was another dinner. But this time it was different. The inspection had passed, the threat had lifted, and the camp returned to something like normalcy. Except now it was not secret. It was sanctioned. The steak returned. But alongside it were other things. Bottles of Coca-Cola, cold and sweating in the Texas heat, apple pie for dessert, made by Pete and Tomiko, working side by side in the kitchen. And on the radio, Glenn Miller's In the Mood played softly. The women ate differently now, not with fear or guilt, but with something closer to peace. Yuki tasted Coca-Cola for the first time. Her eyes went wide. She said something in rapid Japanese that made the other women laugh. The Cowboys laughed too, even though they did not understand the words. Keiko tried the apple pie, closed her eyes as the sweetness and cinnamon filled her mouth. She remembered her mother's attempt at sweets before the war. Nothing like this, but made with the same care. And in that moment she understood something profound. That food was not just sustenance. It was communication. It was culture. It was love made tangible. After dinner, Cole brought out an old baseball, offered to teach them the rules. It was clumsy and chaotic. Yuki threw the ball wildly. It sailed past Cole's head and bounced off the barn. Everyone laughed. Even Wade, standing at a distance, almost smiled. That night, as the women prepared to leave the mess hall, Tomiko did something unexpected. She was sitting near the end of the table, her hair pulled back with flour sack fabric. Cole was passing by with a coffee pot. She cut a thin slice of her steak, balanced it carefully on her fork, and raised it toward him. Not offering exactly, but gesturing, sharing. Cole stopped, blinked. Me? She nodded, not smiling, but her eyes were clear, intentional. He hesitated, looked around. The other women were watching now, so were the Cowboys. The room had gone quiet again, but this time it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of witness. Cole stepped forward, lowered his head slightly, and took the piece of meat from her fork with his own, not eating from her utensil. That would have been too intimate, but accepting the gesture. "Thank you," he said quietly. Tomiko bowed her head, just slightly, and in that moment something fundamental shifted. A prisoner had fed a soldier. It reversed every image painted by war, every propaganda poster, every speech about enemies and annihilation. It was not surrender, it was not friendship, not yet, but it was recognition. That in this strange place they were not entirely who they had once been. That mercy once given and accepted changed both the giver and the receiver. The next morning, small kindnesses multiplied. A cowboy brought extra apples, left them on the kitchen counter without a word. One of the women sewed a button onto a worker's shirt, said nothing. Pete taught Tomiko how to make American biscuits. Flour and butter and technique passed from one set of hands to another. Yuki and Sarah, the rancher's daughter, rode horses together. No shared language, but universal laughter. Keiko found a pencil and began writing. Like Chio, not letters, but journal entries. Thoughts she could not speak aloud. Today I tasted salt and remembered father. Today I laughed and did not feel guilt. Today I offered food and felt powerful. The war is not undone, but something else has begun. In December, the announcement came. The women would be repatriated, sent home to Japan. The war was truly over now. Prisoners were being returned. There was relief and anxiety and grief. They had gained weight, 10, 15 pounds. They had regained the shape of their own presence. But Japan was ruins, the future unknown. Keiko packed her few belongings, folded her uniform. She would not wear it again. She packed letters she had never sent. To her mother, to Takeshi's memory. And then before closing her bag, she took the napkin from her first steak dinner. Wrinkled, stained with a faint ring of grease. It was ridiculous, really. A scrap of cloth from a country she had been taught to hate. But she folded it with reverence, as if it were silk, and tucked it among her belongings like a holy relic. The buses arrived at sunrise. The women gathered their things, said goodbye in the ways they had learned, not with words, but with bows and glance and small touches that carried weight. Cole walked past Tomiko. "Safe travels, ma'am." Her bow was slight but deliberate, more than enough. Pete gave Tomiko the recipe card, already worn at the edges from being folded and unfolded. His handwriting clear, his measurements precise. She tucked it into her pocket, close to her heart. Chio left a poem for the commander. Folded on his desk. He would find it later and cry. Yuki hugged Sarah. The first physical affection shown. and whispered in broken English the phrase Sarah had taught her. See you later. Not goodbye. Later. The engines roared. The countryside began to blur. Keiko stared out the window, saw Cole standing at the edge of the property, hands in his pockets, chewing a stalk of wheat. He did not wave, but he did not look away. Neither did she. In her lap, her hands curled over the napkin. They had fed her not as victory, not as propaganda, but as people who had watched too much death and wanted something else. The war was not undone. The past still lived inside her, hunger, shame, duty. But now beside all that lived another memory, not of bombs, but of broth, not of screaming, but of silence broken by kindness. They returned to Tokyo in winter. The city was half ruins, half rebuilding. Keiko found her mother alive in a makeshift shelter. The reunion was tears and embrace, and words that could not capture the distance traveled. She showed her mother the napkin, tried to explain. Her mother touched the fabric. You survived. That is enough. I did more than survive, Keiko said. I learned. What did you learn that the enemy can teach you more about yourself than victory ever could? The years passed, the women scattered across Japan, but they carried something with them. Tomiko opened a small restaurant in Tokyo. She called it Texas Kitchen. She served American-style steak, marinated the way Pete had taught her. She framed the recipe card on the wall and taught young girls not just cooking, but the story about mercy and handkerchiefs and how food can be a language when words fail. The restaurant became a place where former soldiers, American and Japanese, could meet. At first, it was awkward, silence and sideways glances. But over time, over meals, something changed. Men who had once tried to kill each other shared tables. And in that sharing found something resembling peace. Chio published a poetry collection in 1952, The Enemy's Table. It included poems written at the Texas camp. It became a bestseller, translated into English. It challenged the war narratives with human stories, with small moments of mercy that had been forgotten in the grand histories. One poem, simply titled, Fork, became required reading in schools. It described the pantomime lesson, the absurdity, the laughter, the crack in the wall. Generations of children learned that sometimes the greatest acts of courage are the smallest ones. Yuki became a translator, worked for cultural exchange programs, brought American teachers to Japan, Japanese students to America. She still used the phrase Sarah taught her. See you later, because goodbye felt too final. She married an American, a veteran who had fought in the Pacific. They met at one of Tomiko's dinners. He had been skeptical at first, but Yuki told him about Texas, about the Cowboys, about the mercy that had saved her life, and he listened. And in listening, let go of some of the hate he had carried. Keiko taught nursing, emphasized compassion in medicine, kept the napkin in her desk drawer, showed it to students when teaching about dignity. She married, had a daughter, named her Michi. It meant path, the way forward. Michi became a doctor, worked in refugee camps, Syria, Sudan, Somalia, places where war had left scars. She would tell people that her mother had taught her something important, that healing does not take sides, that mercy is not weakness, that sometimes the greatest weapon against suffering is a meal shared. 40 years later, in 1985, there was a reunion. The Texas Historical Society hosted an event, POW camps in World War II America. Keiko was invited, so were Tomiko and Chiyo. They flew back to America, now in their 50s, gray in their hair, lines on their faces, but still carrying the memories. Backstage before the panel discussion, Keiko was nervous. She clutched the napkin, still carried after 40 years. The stain had faded. The fabric had thinned, but it was still whole. The door opened. An elderly man entered, weathered face, cowboy hat, walking with a cane. It was Cole. You taught me to use a fork, Keiko said in English. She had learned the language in the decades since. Cole's eyes widened. You laughed. I remember. Keiko held up the napkin. From that first meal. Cole touched the fabric. Tears fell. I didn't know if any of it mattered, if any of you remembered. Tomiko emerged from the dressing room, saw Cole, gasped, pulled out the recipe card, now laminated, worn at the edges. Pete's biscuits, she said. I make them every Sunday. Cole's voice broke. He died in 1978. He would have loved to know that. They sat together in that small room for another hour, sharing stories, filling gaps. Cole told them about the letters he had written over the years. Never sent, but written anyway. Letters to Keiko about the horses, letters to Tomiko about the kitchen, letters to Chio about her poems that he had tried to find in bookstores. I wanted you to know, he said quietly, that it mattered, that it changed me too. Keiko reached across the table, took his hand, an old woman's hand holding an old man's hand. But in that touch was the weight of everything they had survived. We did change each other, she said. That was the point. Cole told them about Wade, how he had come to the 20-year reunion in 1965, how he had approached Cole with tears in his eyes and said he was sorry, how he had said that his son would have wanted him to choose mercy over hate. Wade had died in 1972, but before he did, he had written a letter to the Historical Society, asking that his story be told. Not as a hero, but as a man who had learned too late that mercy was stronger than vengeance. That letter was now part of the exhibit, alongside Chio's poems, alongside photographs of the camp, alongside the napkin that Keiko was about to donate. They understood sitting there in that small room in Texas 40 years later that what had happened in 1945 was not just history. It was seed, planted in soil that had been scorched by war, and it had grown into something neither side could have predicted. Mercy, they realized, was not weakness. It was the most subversive form of strength, because it refused to accept that enemies had to remain enemies, that hatred was permanent, that the cost of war was only paid in blood. Sometimes the cost was paid in kindness, in forks and napkins and recipe cards, in laughter and tears and the hard work of seeing the human in the enemy. On stage during the panel, Keiko held up the napkin. "This is why I am here." A young student in the audience asked, "Why did you keep it?" Keiko looked at Cole, then at Tomiko and Chio, then back at the student. "Because it reminds me that dignity is not given by power. It is recognized in moments when someone feeds you not to dominate, but to understand. When someone teaches you how to use a fork, not because they pity you, but because they see you. When someone offers mercy, not because you deserve it, but because they refuse to become the monster they were fighting." The audience was silent. Then someone began to clap. Then another. Then the entire room stood. After the panel, a young Japanese-American woman approached Keiko. She was a student, studying history. She had tears in her eyes. "My grandmother was in the camps," she said, "the American internment camps. She never talked about it. The shame was too much." Keiko took her hand. "Tell her," she said, "tell her that shame is not the same as guilt. That survival is not betrayal. That accepting mercy is not weakness." The woman nodded. "Thank you." That night at the banquet, Keiko sat between Cole and Tomiko. They ate steak, and the taste was exactly as she remembered. Not just the flavor, but the meaning. Before they left, Keiko donated the napkin to the Smithsonian. It would be displayed in the museum behind glass. A small scrap of cloth stained with grease. Most people walk past it without noticing. But those who stop and read the plaque learn about a mess hall in Texas, about a young nurse and a cowboy, about steak and forks and the moment when everything changed. They learn that the war ended in documents and surrender speeches, but it truly ended in kitchens, in gestures, in napkins folded with care, one steak at a time, one person at a time. Keiko died in 2008. She was 79 years old. Her daughter Michi was with her, holding her hand. In her final moments, Keiko whispered, "Tell them the truth about what, Mom? About the enemy, about mercy, about how the smallest acts can change the world." Michi promised, and she kept that promise. She wrote a book, based on her mother's journals, based on the letters Keiko had saved, based on the photograph General Miller had given her all those years ago. The book was published in 2010. It was translated into 15 languages. It became required reading in schools across America and Japan. And every year on the anniversary of that first steak dinner, students from both countries gather at the Smithsonian. They stand in front of the napkin, and they remember. They remember that victory is counted in territory and treaties. But humanity is measured in smaller things, in salt and shame, in fat and memory, in compassion served hot. And sometimes that is enough to change the world. The napkin still hangs in the Smithsonian Museum of American History. Section D, fourth floor, display case number 247. The plaque reads, "This napkin belonged to Keiko Tanaka, a Japanese field nurse held at a Texas POW camp in 1945. It is stained with grease from the first steak dinner she was served by her American captors. She kept it for 63 years as a reminder that dignity can survive war and that mercy is sometimes found in the most unexpected places." Her story and the stories of women like her remind us that the true cost of war is not just measured in casualties, but in the humanity we risk losing along the way, and that the greatest victories are often the quietest ones. Sometimes all it takes is a fork, a napkin, and the courage to see your enemy as human. If this story moved you, remember this: the moments history nearly forgot are often the ones that matter most.